All right, we are back on the Air We Breathe. We are on now chapter 7, entitled Freedom. Now, this was an interesting chapter, I thought, not just for the content, but thematically. It makes perfect sense, but I have to say that in advance, if you tell me you're going to talk about freedom, I think of that in a positive fashion. And this was really in a negative fashion. We weren't really talking about what we might refer to as a positive right, but the avoidance of a negative right, if that makes any sense. So this chapter was mostly about slavery.
Yeah.
Now, the opposite of slavery being freedom, I've got zero problem with, and the ethic of freedom and why slavery is so rejected today, also 100% on. It was just a little bit surprising to me because I think we could very easily have a discussion about freedom and about freedom being a modern and contemporary ethic without either mentioning slavery at all or having it be a very secondary issue. And yet, within the chapter, finding these concepts inextricably linked, but linked in such a way that, again, we're not even asking why anymore. That's just how thoroughly our perspectives, I'm not even going to say our opinions, but like just the worldview has so fully and completely changed because of the sake of the gospel that these things just kind of fit almost in a one-to-one fashion. So these opening quotes have usually been a pretty good starting place. Every chapter has offered a pretty nice one. And this one is from Keir Starmer, who is now the Prime Minister of Great Britain, by the way. So when he said this in 2020, he was just a member of Parliament at that point. You can't, in 21st century Britain, have a slaver on a statue. And so it is making reference in that 2020 post George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, and a variety of other social issues where we saw, I didn't think twice about the UK, to be perfectly frank, because we had this going all over the place here in America. And I sort of assumed it was a rather stateside parochial affair. So I didn't notice that they were having similar discussions in Great Britain. I mean, it makes sense, but I wasn't thinking about that at all.
I don't follow British news.
I really don't follow much. So without, in a nutshell, because this is not about the movements or the taking down statues or whatever, so much as it is, there is an ethic behind this. And the ethic is where it leads us into these, I think, deeper questions and why we have the assumptions that we have. So in light of historical injustices, in light of the personal attributes or the histories of the people involved on statues, a bunch of statues were removed, taken down, broken up, whatever it was. We had at least one here in Polk County. That was it at Munn Park, maybe?
Yeah.
And we had all sorts of protests and issues locally happening all over the place about statues, renaming of buildings. That was another big one. And the issue at that point, so many of them were slave related.
Mm-hmm.
The ownership of slaves, the selling of slaves. And so if that had been a part of that person's history, the issue was, well, they should not be honored. And that becomes a real kind of tricky historical wicket. When do the failings of the person preclude their remembrance and or honor by successive generations? And what happens when perspectives have changed so fundamentally that something that was uncontroversial at one time becomes very controversial in another? So how do you manage this? How do you deal with this? How do you think through these issues? And that's something that's ongoing, honestly. This is not the first time people have taken issue with a monument or a statue or a building being named after something after the fact. It is people are weird in the sense that we're very complicated things, and our histories are very complicated. Human history is very complicated, and personal histories are very complicated. There's a lot of things that we just don't realize or pay attention to, but they could potentially have as many issues as some of the slavery ones that were brought up. Volkswagen as a company, Volkswagen, the vehicle of the people. That was not just a German company, that was a Nazi company. Do they have anything to do with Nazis these days? No, but at what point does any kind of association sort of change the way that we view something? I think somewhere in my house, I might still have one, but about 15 years ago or so, 20 years ago, everybody had a little home, it seemed that way, a little home espresso maker. Those little small ones, they had a little frothing attachment, and you like made one little cup at a time. And the biggest manufacturer was Krups, and who still manufacture a variety of things, including stuff like that. I mean, Krups made munitions. That was another German company owned by the nation, owned by the state, and they made like artillery. Like this wasn't even just kind of an ancillary thing. Like, you made, explosives in a war. But when do we, have a change about how we view things, or which things should remain in the past, or which things are issues now? All of that is not what the chapter is really talking about, so much as it is, why would the people who are advocating the removal of names or the removal of statues feel it not just so significantly, but it was an obvious course of action? The fact that we could say that slavery is an obvious wrong is a change. It's a change in this country's history, obviously, but it is a change in world history. America has a deep past of wrestling, and sometimes very unsuccessfully, with racial issues, but slavery has never been a uniquely American problem. It's a worldwide issue that its abolition, less than 300 years ago, is really the huge outlier in human history.
Yeah, there was one section in this chapter that talked about how it had gradually died out in the Netherlands and then the rest of the so forth, so on, over a period of a couple of hundred years.
That's right. That's right. And even that, it was a slow process, but this was a change, a rather substantial change. And a lot of this had to do with Great Britain forcing the issue. We are gonna personally reject it, and we who, Britannia rules the seas. Remember, if we're going to stop the act of trade, well, then you basically have to learn to live without it. And as you learn to live without it, you realize I don't want it anyway. And some of these things will kind of die on the vine. In a very strange, this is just a little historical tidbit. It is not inconceivable that it's not inconceivable that slavery would have died out in the States without in a different fashion than it did. One of the strange little, is a trivial point, but the invention of the cotton gin, which was actually supposed to take the place of needing people, actually revives the Southern agricultural economy, which was sort of dying on the vine at the time. And by reviving that economy, it reinforced the need for more workers, hence the keeping of the slaves. And so it was a huge irony that that a machine that was actually intended to basically make slavery obsolete wound up reinforcing it, at least in the short term. Anyway, beyond our little historical points, we are back to the same thing about human rights, the same thing about human dignity, the same thing about the care of the poor or infants or conquered peoples that we've hit on other chapters. There seems to be something innate within human history, if not innate in humanity itself, where nature wants to tell us that might makes right, that the lion eats the gazelle, and that the bigger gorilla is in control of the area over the smaller gorillas. And that if you can make somebody do what you want them to do, why wouldn't you? If you could control someone utterly and completely, why wouldn't you? And so basically every society and throughout the world and throughout history, some organization, some human rights organization has published statistics that I will not try to I'll not try to quote because I don't know them. I'm not even sure how they come up with these numbers, but at least the phrase I have heard that there are more slaves alive today in the world than there have been at any other point in human history. Now, that seems so bizarre to us. Like, how can that possibly be true? And the issue is, it's just one of proportion. So it's one of the pure numbers because the world population is so large. In little pockets where slavery is either allowed or it is just kind of a de facto, it's never called slavery, but it is. It's basically forced work camps or whatever it might be. That just in pure numbers, it's this far larger group of people than there would have been at a, 300 years ago when the human population of Earth was much smaller. Even if the proportion of people who were in bondage was higher, the pure numbers now, just because of our world population, actually makes this something. The idea is it's supposed to be a shocking quote because we think of slavery as a relic. It doesn't exist. We killed it. It's like polio. We got it. It took a long time. There was much suffering, but eventually we got it and it's dead, except it's not. Because again, it seems to be something in human nature, if not just in human history, where if given the ability to control someone else utterly and completely, why not? We would say why not is because it's wrong. It violates scripture from the beginning. It violates our purpose as God's own creatures and those who are made in his image. Old Testament and New are replete with an ethic that makes slavery, if not impossible, then difficult, even while scripture, Old Testament and New, acknowledges its existence. That's been a long time source of consternation. Well, how can you say the Bible condemns slavery when it talks about slaves? And I would just say it is not unlike, and this comes up in this chapter, when they asked Jesus about the divorce laws. Did Moses have laws for them on how to divorce your wife and do it the best way possible? And he said, yes, but why? Was that God's purpose and intention? He says, no. He gave that to you because of the hardness of your own hearts and the stiffness of your own necks. Because our world and ourselves, because we're broken, there's an acknowledgement of the brokenness of humanity. There's an acknowledgement of the systemic failure that we're all a part of. But that's not God's intention. He goes, even in that argument about marriage and divorce, what does Jesus then quote next? He goes back to Genesis. He goes back to creation. In the beginning, God creates a male and female. The man will leave his family and cleave to the wife and all this kind of stuff. So to hearken back to first principles, that's how we might put this. First principles is that God has marked us not as belonging to one another, but belonging to him. Well, why doesn't the Bible then just say free all slaves because it's bad and wrong? Well, in some places it does do that. He makes reference of the concept of the Old Testament Jubilee within the kingdom of Israel. That would preclude what we would consider to be generational slavery, because there was always a finite deadline on any of these things. That doesn't make slavery as a concept better, but it does mean that it's finite. It has an ending point. It is not permanent. It's not eternal. It's not for your children. It's not for your children's children. Neither your family nor your race is in bondage in perpetuity. As a matter of fact, that every 40 years, all debts were wiped clean. So that's this joyful time of basically community and renewal. So it would preclude anything that we would consider this sort of permanent chattel slavery. But slavery around that ancient world was obviously known all over the place. The Romans were particularly adept at keeping and maintaining slaves because they had such a high ethic of citizenship. If you were not a citizen, you were to be used kind of however others, the more powerful, wanted. Captured people, the losers in wars, your life was forfeit. They could kill you or they could just keep you, and you really had no alternative. And if they kept you, you could be killed as well too. So again, this is at a time where it can be racially motivated, but not in the way that we might think of that today. It's more of whichever tribe or whichever people I beat, well, you're all no good and you're less than me. And it didn't really matter beyond that, what specifically you looked like.
Property force is going to be.
That's right. And here's a kind of an interesting thing that gets pulled back later in the chapter, that a lot of this ethic, especially in the time of Enlightenment and Renaissance, and now we're getting into the 16, 17, 1800s, they're not going back to scriptural reasons, but they hearken back to Aristotle. Did you catch that? Where Aristotle basically says, look, it's obvious that some people are inferior because you got winners and you got losers. You got the strong empires and you've got the weak people who are always getting beaten. Obviously, nature points to the fact that they should be enslaved because that's all they're good for. That's the evidence. And so hearkening back to that is to take, and when Christians did that, when members of the church did that, when policy did that would even say this is informed by Christian thought, would then go back to pre-Christian pagan philosophy and say, this is our proof. This is the rationale. How much do you have to twist and turn in order to continue to justify it? It is right condemnation to point to people who were using scripture in previous centuries to point to the rightness or the appropriateness of slavery. That is not to say that such passages don't exist in scriptures. I said that they typically are just descriptive. They're not proscriptive. This is what you ought to do. They are descriptive, which is observing what simply is currently happening and trying to manage and mitigate it. But if there were ever world-class proof texters, it's those who would use scripture to justify enslavement, where they will pick a sentence, half a verse, 2 verses out of a context and say, that's it. We would say today, oh, proof texting is it's wrong and it's bad. And you actually understand what the verse is saying before you can rightly apply it. And if you pull it out of context, what if you have said the wrong thing? This always comes to mind for some reason when I think about it, but I remember super distinctly, for no good reason, listening to an interview on the radio, gosh, 20 years ago, where they had what I'm sure this woman was a faithful Christian or wanted to be, but she was up in arms about Harry Potter. And she was saying this book is an evil, wicked influence because it's about witchcraft. And I'm going to read a quote from you. And she reads a quote, and it said, "There is no good or evil, only power and those too weak to use it." And she said, "See, this is a terrible book and you should never give it to your children. It's going to corrupt us all and blah, 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 blah." Wow. What a man. That is an awful thing to say. Maybe that book is. She was quoting from a passage where the villain was speaking. That was the bad guy of the book. That wasn't, the book was not trying to extol that as a virtue. That was the villain that everyone knew at the time was saying something wicked and wrong. But if you pull that quote straight out without any context whatsoever and say, see what's in this book? That's like pulling a quote out of a book that would say something like, beat them until done. Like, oh my gosh, like how violent do you have to be? Well, it's a cookbook and it's talking about eggs and a cake. You know, sometimes you have to be able to get enough around it before you realize what it's actually trying to say. So, and this is where there's a nuance here, but this nuance is not. I'm not trying to blow smoke. The book of Philemon, it's very, very brief. It's 1 chapter. I recommend it for people to read just periodically because it is an excellent book. The book of Philemon talks about slavery very directly. That's really the purpose of the book, because Philemon owned Onesimus, the slave. Onesimus runs away, and Paul receives him. Onesimus becomes a Christian. And there's this dialogue now between Paul and Philemon about what ought to happen to Onesimus next. And Paul basically says, you know, the law is the law. I'm going to send Onesimus back to you, but I'm sending him back to you as your brother. And if he has injured you in any way, if he has cost you money in any way, if he's caused you trouble in any way, please put that on my account, not on his. And this very profound way of not just saying, Philemon, you ought to free all of your slaves and slavery is wrong. It takes this brief book, 1 chapter long, but it creates this perspective that says, in Christ, you know how he will also write in a completely different book, there's no Jew or Gentile, slave or free. This man, not less than you, not beast, not animal, not piece of equipment, this man who Christ loves as much as he loves you, who died for him as much as he died for you. I sent him back to you, understanding that this man is your brother. with the implicit, well, then how am I supposed to treat him? You treat him like your brother. Do you enslave your brother? Do you force your brother to work? Do you own your brother? None of these things. He doesn't have to say it. So here's the deal. Like we tell small children, because of the way they think very concretely, do this, don't do that. We give them very clear steps because they can't process otherwise. The older they get, the more abstract they can think, but also the more we assume that their maturity needs to start standing in for our voice, because there's going to come a point where you're not there, right? They grow up at some point. They go to college, they go to work, they move away, they have children of their own, whatever it is. And you're not going to be there every moment to say, now I want you to turn left, now I want you to turn right, now I want you to tie your shoes and always brush your teeth. At some point, your external discipline of them, you hope, filters into their life, into their thoughts, into their hearts, into their character. And so instead of becoming external and extrinsic, it becomes internal and intrinsic. They now eat their vegetables because it's right and good, and they don't need mom to threaten to send them to their room without dessert. They now pick up their room because they want things to be tidy and orderly and clean, not because they're afraid they're going to get spanked. Right? And that's kind of the hope. So in this growing sense of faith and maturity and discipleship, rather than no, do this, don't do that. More of a sense of, now that I've explained the situation, what do you think? What do you think? How do you think you ought to treat him? What do you think you ought to do next? It's very clear by implication, but it stops just shy of saying, this is your checklist that you have to follow or else. Because again, that's what we give to children. That's not what we give to adults. Or at least that's not what we want to have to give to our own children as they grow. We hope that they become the sort of people that do the right thing because they know and they want to do the right thing. So through Old Testament and New, we have a sense of challenge to the way that humanity has ordered itself again and again and again, culture after culture after culture. Sometimes it's explicit, like the Jubilee, 40 years, everybody should be free. Sometimes it is less explicit and more encouraging to do the right thing, like Philemon. But it is still there. It is still there regardless. Remember, this is the same gospel that reached the poor and the oppressed first. This is the same gospel that when Jesus makes his first public sermon, he picks the scroll from Isaiah, and he is to give good news to the poor. This is the same gospel that before Jesus is born, Mary utters in the Magnificat that God is honoring and caring for the poor, but for the rich, they're going to go away empty. So how we get from a place where it is ubiquitous in human culture to a place where we seem shocked that it exists at all anywhere has to come from somewhere. And this is where it's coming from. It is so unquestioned at this point. If anything, if people think about slavery in the Bible, I have a feeling that most Americans might shift immediately to pre-Civil War and say, oh, yeah, because the Bible said slavery was okay, with glossing over. The entire abolitionist movement has almost no context at all, except for faithful Christians saying this is contrary, not just to God's word, God's purpose. But it also just doesn't hang this sense of another human ought not to be owned by and controlled by another human unless there is some overarching ethic beyond what we can observe in nature. Otherwise, this is just the same old culture that existed for thousands of years all over the world. that again said, if I am strong enough or scary enough to do it to you, why wouldn't I? I thought he did a pretty decent representation of the Declaration of Independence for an Australian writing to mostly English, readers. Not bad, not bad. I think that it's almost difficult to understate the importance of those words in the concept of not just American history, but what America means philosophically, emotionally, theologically. From the beginning, from its founding, these were words that were separating out to say we are striking out on our own, to their renewal at the Civil War, where its failure to fulfill its promise was paid for by nearly 750,000 deaths, and renewed again in the Civil Rights Movement, where hearkening back to first principles, kind of like Jesus talking about divorce and going back to Genesis, Martin Luther King Jr. goes back to the founding of the country and first principles of America to say, if all men were created equal, where is it? It's like a check that you've written, but you're not cashing. You're not giving us the money. It's bouncing. You've said this is true. You've said this was not just a matter of America's understanding. This was how humanity should be understood. So let's see it. Not just part of it, let's see all of it. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creators with certain inalienable rights, chiefly among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So these are profoundly powerful words. They are deeply woven and embedded and imprinted and constitute the essence of what America is supposed to be. And like all things, we fulfill and we fall short in every avenue of life in which we have some sort of foundational principle. But the words here are both, I think, profoundly true, but also at the heart of this issue, why freedom and slavery within this chapter seems so disconnected in our minds from where this understanding has come from. Very common to talk about, oh, this is Enlightenment talk, that this is coming directly from the works of English philosophers or Scottish philosophers like John Locke. Like, I mean, if you remember your American history and all this kind of stuff, but those also came from somewhere. And this is growth from the soil of the gospel, from the soil of Scripture, from the soil of the very beginnings in Genesis and how God created humanity, not by separating out races, not even by separating out sexes. Both Adam and Eve made in the image of God. And if that's the case from the beginning, then it's our humanity that is blessed with the dignity of reflecting something of the nature of the Creator. And gosh, what did we just read in 1 John at Rob's service this morning? But about if you say you had no sin, you make God to be a liar. But this sense of like violating the purposes of God in such a way as though you're basically telling God to shove it. You're wrong. That's the essence of what we do. when and I'm not one, this is where I digress on stuff and I get myself into trouble. I've always been a little twitchy about there's been a huge push since I've been an adult within the Episcopal Church about the baptismal covenant and about the one piece, respect the dignity of every human being. And it's a piece that I think is very right and it's very true, but it felt like, especially back in the 90s when I was in seminary, that's the only thing they ever wanted to talk about. Now, pendulums swing for a reason, and sometimes things get too far in one way, they have to swing back. But it was like harping on it and harping on it and harping on it. And that's not the sum total of your promises in baptism, and that's not the sum total of what it means to be a disciple of Christ, is to respect the dignity of every human being. But it is an essential element. So we integrate that in the same manner that we integrate, I believe in God the Father Almighty, Jesus Christ the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We integrate in the same way that we integrate the way we treat people, the way we view them of equal worth and worthy of respect has to stand right along the lines with, and I will continue in the apostles' teaching in the breaking of the bread. You know, all of this stands together because it all ought to be of kind of the seamless garment, to use the phrase. So these are things I believe fully and completely are true, but I believe them fully and completely to be true because God has told us and he has shown us, not because the material world encourages it or supports it. It is not self-evident in that regard. I believe it is self-evident in the same way that we look at the starry sky and the vast expanse of stuff, and our spirits, I don't care how jaded you are, something deep inside of you just says, wow. Just says, wow. And we consider this is not just random electrical, biochemical impulses, but there is something in this grandeur that makes us connect to something beyond us. This is Richard Wagner saying all great music is intrinsically religious. There's something about the heights of what humanity can achieve. There's something about the most amazing elements of creation. They stir our souls that there must be a God. But the self-evident thing, you look in human history or you look in the animal kingdom, and there's not a lot of dignity out there. There's just not. What's so self-evident if they have to be written out? If it's self-evident, you shouldn't even have to write it, right? You just know. Everybody knows. Duh. You don't have to say it. You don't have to make its case if it's self-evident. Now, we can say it should be self-evident because I believe it should be, but I have an enormous capacity to agree with myself. So whatever my opinion is, oh boy, can I justify that, man. So it doesn't matter so much that my opinion is right, so much as it's my opinion. But this is a statement about humanity that's really interesting because I do believe it is descriptive because I think this is how God has made us. But it's also proscriptive because it says the world isn't like this, but it ought to be. But the only way we can say that is by the presence of God. That's the curved line that's only curved in comparison to the straight. We can only say ought or should because the very nature of God has that ability to say there is a way that things ought and should be. There is a right and there's a wrong. It's not an opinion. It's not random. It's not just the way things are or an accident of a blind creation. It is, we can say no. Some things are not the way they're supposed to be. And supposed to means there is a thought, an intelligence, and a purpose behind something that is being violated. That's why Martin Luther King could say, it doesn't matter what the democratic process said. I don't care that you had X number of people vote for X number of politicians who then wrote X number of laws that then make these unfair things happen. He's saying, look back at the founding documents of the first principles. There's the ought. It ought to be this way. It should be as it said in the founding principles, not in what you've done now, because might makes right. I have the votes and I'm going to do it. If I can have the votes to give myself everything and take it all away from you, why shouldn't I? That's the same argument we've had about slavery in every culture throughout human history. But to be able to point to something that says, no, that may be the way that things are or the way things could be, but that's not the way that they ought to be. And if we have the power to help create the ought and the should, it is incumbent upon us to do that. So it may not be self-evident, but it ought to be self-evident. But we can only say it ought to be self-evident because there is a God who has a purpose that we can fulfill or a purpose that we can fall short of. But here's, I want to say this was around like a Sunday that was close to July 4th. It was on July 4th or something like that. Inalienable. It's an interesting phrase. It's a specific term that we don't tend to put a lot of thought into, but it actually means something kind of interesting. It means basically two things depending on the context. To alienate something means to basically separate it out, to remove something in a permanent fashion. These are rights that cannot be taken away from you. We all sort of seem to understand that. They're inalienable. But the other half of that term, as a technical term, means they cannot be sold. We don't tend to think about that, but it's also true. That's what the term means. We use it not in common everyday speech, but we have come across it at some point. If you have ever signed, if you've ever bought a house and signed the title, because that's the language of property. If you may alienate property, you may sell it. For property to be unalienable means it cannot be sold. So I think there's something, this is a very kind of sideways point, but I've always found that, I don't know who told me that years ago, because I'm no realtor, but it really struck me in its importance that these rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, cannot be taken from us, not rightly. I mean, they can by force, but it's not right. Yeah. We also cannot sell it. We can't give it away. It's ours, no matter what. I think of people who are desperate, whose lives feel like they're at the end of their rope, or they're lost in a pit of despair or addiction, and they would sell anything. They would sell any possession. They would sell their bodies. They would sell their souls if they could, but it is inalienable. They cannot sell their souls, first of all. And secondly, these rights, even then, even if you get desperate, or even if you get worried, or even if you don't care, you can't sell them. Not even to the highest bidder. And I think that's very profound. So
People used to sell slaves.
not only do they used to sell slaves, it is not a direct correlation to slavery, because it had an ending point, but there's a lengthy history, even in the early stages of this country, especially those who were coming over, of indentured servitude. You would sell yourself into a temporary slavery. So apparently there is a strain of my mother's family that can trace back to the Mayflower. That's really cool. Oh, the Mayflower, that's really neat. He was an indentured servant. This guy that they think they've made the connection to. There was a handful of people who had no money to pay for the voyage. So what they did was, I will be your slave for 10 years and I'll work off this debt. But you'll basically own me. Like anything you tell me to do, or I mean, I have to abide by this. I have no freedom of my own. I have alienated my freedom, to be honest. But then once that term was complete, almost like a prison sentence, then you are free. So, and that's the case for this particular guy. We don't have indentured servitude either for the same reason. We have certain very narrowly construed ways in which your freedom can be abrogated, and that's basically the penal system of justice, you know, where you may your liberties are curtailed, or they're held in check, or they're abrogated, or whatever. The legal scholars understand this stuff and could explain it with a lot of technical ability, but this is nothing that we are supposed to be able to do anything with. These things, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, these are the things, again, we are endowed by our Creator. That's a hearkening back to Genesis. We are made in the image of God, a Creator with a purpose, and we reflect, not just His purpose, we reflect God. Something very essential about God's character and about God's nature. And it is reflected in our common humanity, no matter what you look like, no matter where you're from, no matter the color of your skin, the length of your hair, all this stuff. Let's use Aristotle for a good reason again. You know, like we got into a couple of weeks ago, accidents and essence. In your essential humanity, whatever it is that makes you a human, that has been created by God and reflects God. The accidents, those are the incidental details that don't change your humanity. Just because you're taller or older, you don't cease to be human. Humans have 10 fingers. Okay, but somebody who lost one in an accident, does that make them not human? No, because that's not the essence of humanity is 10 fingers. It's an accident, not in the oops, I cut off my finger kind of accident, but in an Aristotelian sense of the details that are interesting, but don't change its actual definition. So our common humanity is just that, common across humanity. And it comes from God, and it reflects God's own nature. Why would we ever, and how dare we, treat the image of God in any way other than with dignity and respect, regardless of what form in which we see it? And that's really, I think, where we're getting in this. That has become so fully accepted, and thank God for it. You know, I'm not one who says, well, things are always getting better. I think progress is more often than not a marketing ploy rather than a reality. But you want to point to some real progress? How about this? How about the fact that it is just absolutely accepted that you shouldn't own another person? Because that's not the way it used to be for a long time. And we can even say it is self-evident despite all of the historical evidence to the contrary, because it's still true. But it's only true because it reflects the nature of God. All right, so what else? What else did we catch in this one?
I was thinking that he started the chapter referring to George Floyd.
Yes.
And I was wondering if the reaction would have been the same if George Floyd was kind of a rough-looking white man instead of a black man.
Probably not. Probably not at all. I think, you know, that they would say that was the real issue, that It was, so both sides hopefully acknowledge the fact that he wasn't a good dude.
Yeah.
But people in their circumstances and the circumstances they find themselves in can become symbolic. And so that's why I would assume that the symbolism becomes very, very powerful for people. Because it can be then connected to not just a single moment, but through a history of things, all sorts of things get connected and lumped into one. In a roundabout way, there's an aphorism in marriage counseling that the argument about who left the cap off the toothpaste tube is never about the toothpaste tube. It is the presenting factor of 500 other things. It's the straw that broke the camel's back, in essence. So you get real chippy about this one thing. It's like, why are we yelling and screaming? It's toothpaste. Well, it's because you're not really arguing about toothpaste. That's just like you had so much built up inside of you that when you got poked in this one spot, it all leaked out. So, again, humans have a really remarkable capacity to justify their own opinions and beliefs. And I would say there are almost innumerable injustices that people could pick on and say, you know what, this is untenable and society must change because that's just flat wrong. You know, why that one? I don't know. I mean, I can come up with guesses, and I think there's some sociological reasons, but you know, pick any world crisis right now that's got everybody's opinions very, oh, this war or this conflict or whatever, and it's blah, 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 blah. Okay, how about the other three that look like this except way worse, but they happen into a corner of the world that you're not paying attention to or you don't care about? I am apolitical as a preacher and generally speaking as a pastor. But again, we can very easily fixate on the stuff that we want to and be willfully blind of this other issue that's the same or worse, but it doesn't fit into what we want to argue about. So we just, you know, that's not important, but this is everything. And that is, I think that's to our failing. That's part of our, you know, broken humanity. But, you know, this issue, especially like like the statues and, you know, renaming stuff, and it's a complicated one. And it's not divorced completely from other issues of the day that are just a little different. They're a little maybe less serious, but you know, when and how do you separate the art from the artist? That is a phrase that can be used for a variety of things, but if we just stick with like art, a lot of great artists that we really admire their paintings or their skill or whatever were terrible people, just awful. Does that mean that the person should not be honored or respected or remembered or whatever? And to what degree should their bad behavior influence the way that we see their art? It's a complicated thing. And I would say I want to be able to appreciate the art for its technical sense and for, you know, kind of what I see or what makes me feel or whatever. Sometimes I don't want to know anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it feels like a burden to know that some of these artists were like rotten people, because oh man, you know, you want to watch a movie and then the actor pops off on social media and says the stupidest, meanest thing, and you're like, oh man, I just wanted to watch this movie, and now I'm thinking about how dumb you are. So in a more serious fashion, historical figures, it's not wrong that society has changed and we can look back and say, you know, that would never fly today. Certain things were said or certain things were done or, you know, whatever. But to what degree does that influence the way we remember those events or remember those people in a kind of holistic fashion. And that's where it becomes very complicated. Frankly, I think history is best preserved and then dealt with. I don't like the removal of things, not so much because I disagree with the sentiment, but because it still happened. And when you remove all traces of it, it's almost as though it didn't happen, but it did. Like, I really like Thomas Jefferson, and I really hate some of the things that he did and said. But he was a complicated person who had all sorts of facets to him, stuff that are very laudable and stuff that weren't. But if we just like remove him because he did bad things, number one, we miss all the good. But number two, if we remove him, it's like, well, no, we never had a president who owned slaves. He disappeared. It's a big blot and, just gone. Like, no, how about we wrestle with the fact that it happened? Because I think that's more important because we don't want it to happen again. We've got examples to say, and don't do that. Do this stuff that Jefferson did. Don't do this stuff that Jefferson did. But we have no positive and negative example if we just kind of erase people. We take down statues and like, okay, some statues probably shouldn't have been put up in the first
Every
place.
Confederate general is suddenly gone.
Yeah, I get
The Civil War never happened.
I get that there's some reasons why, and there's some pretty ugly reasons why a few things are done. Like, oh, we're gonna put up this Confederate statue. Brown versus Board of Education was just passed. You know what the school board office really needs? A statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest. Gainesville. That actually happened. So yeah, like maybe that was a purposeful, ugly shot. But where do you draw the line between bad intentions and just a change in perspective of society? Sometimes by wanting to remove these things, it gives an inadvertent sense that we can change the past to suit us. We can't. We really are. And I think we might do better by keeping it and explaining it than by getting rid of it. And now there's this sense that history started whenever we appeared on the scene. History started yesterday when I was born, because that's clearly the central element. It's also, I think, the other deep flaw to that is we're all Robespierre in that regard, where we're leading the charge of the revolution until it swings back around to come get us. Robespierre was right in the forefront in the French Revolution, and get them and kill them and we'll make them pay, until he was not sufficiently revolutionary to the taste of the crowd at that moment, and then now it's him at the guillotine being executed. There's some stuff that we do today that does not make a hill of beans to us. But 100 years from now, there may be a society that says, they did what? And to be honest, maybe that society is going to be right. Maybe we're just not there yet. But does that mean we ought to be erased? I mean, I hope not. Because I'm not saying whatever we do is worth preserving. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that we have a blind spot to our own failings. And then we go and we pick the speck out of the eye of someone in history. And without calling slavery a speck, which I'm not, I'm just saying the flaws, the failings, the sins of others always seem to be super important to us. But our own flaws and failings and sin always have a good justifiable excuse, or, oh, I just never noticed that. Huh, my bad. So what do we do? that 100 years from now, society will say, how could they have possibly done that? There's this really funny line. The fourth Star Trek movie, which was a pretty popular one, it was the one where they have to travel back in time and find a whale because there's this alien presence in the Star Trek future and is inadvertently destroying everything. And it turns out because it's looking for whales, but we killed all the whales, generations ago. So Captain Kirk and the crew, they have to find a way to, they basically travel back in time, and they are going to get a whale, and they're going to bring it back to the future to save the future. But so there they are trying to get around like basically the late 80s in America, and they're from the 24th century. And one of the elements is one of the guys gets hurt. He actually like falls off a balcony or something like that, and he sustains this injury to his brain, and it's going to be like some intracranial pressure and a hematoma. And so they take him to the hospital, to a American hospital of the 1980s. And then Dr. McCoy, the Star Trek Bones doctor from the 24th century, he finds out what they're doing. He's like, my God, they're like witch doctors. They're not even using the whatever. Like, obviously, they're going to poke holes in his head, like they're letting the evil spirits out. Because we would do this, like to alleviate intracranial pressure that's going to kill somebody, we would literally drill a hole in, and that does alleviate some pressure so that other things can happen in the healing. But, in the 24th century, they had the technology to just heal it. So cutting a hole in somebody's head seems like, the primitive, like, let the evil spirit out. And so, but it was just that sense of, because we're so far past that, something that seems very obvious to us now, it's some far-flung future, might seem ridiculously primitive or stupid or wrong. So we might be next. Who knows?
Oh, when Abraham Lincoln died, one of the things the doctors did was bleed him.
Yes. There have been a few of our presidential deaths that were directly attributed to their medical care, which was the best idea at the time. If anyone's going to get the best medical care in the country, it's going to be a sitting president. But I think it's McKinley who dies. And who's the one? McKinley's after assassination attempt, but Zachary Taylor, I think, who dies relatively early on. And they think he might have inadvertently poisoned himself. But then the way they treated him made him weaker and sicker, and he eventually died. But they're not doing this on purpose. Like, how can we get rid of Zachary Taylor? It's more like, no. The very best minds at the time were doing their very best technical abilities. But guess what? They were wrong. They were wrong. We know better now. But does that mean they were trying to harm him? No. But it does mean that we've got a better idea of what could have helped him. Then again, in 200 years, we might have diseases today that we're like, what can you do? And they're like, what do you mean, what do you do? You give them this pill and you run them through this machine and they're fixed. Like, what, you still have cancer in 2024? Like, hey, Bill, when did they fix cancer? In 2099? Oh, my bad. It's coming. We don't know. But that is a part of the future that we don't know what things about us, because we're on the right side of history or whatever. We are until history decides, I guess, which we're not going to know because we won't be around. So maybe we got it right, but maybe we didn't. All right. Anything else? Okay. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.